Here's what I want to know. After learning about the VOC and the House of Orange, do you think today's tech giants like Apple, Amazon, or Nvidia could ever reach that level of power and influence? Comment below, and let's debate this. There's this Dutch company. It's around 400 years old, and it's outrageously valuable. Think about Apple, Microsoft, Amazon, Saudi Aramco, and now combine all of their market value, and you still won't get to the valuation of this 400-year-old company. Look, when you think about capitalism, wealth creation, and old money, the first names that often come to mind are the Rothschilds or the Rockefellers. People like them, right? It's rare for us to think about this quiet little Dutch company that was groundbreaking. I created the world's first corporation, the first stock exchange, and the first IPO. And this company is still around, by the way, so buckle in. Today, we now get into the bizarre story of the Dutch East India Company and the House of Orange. You see, Spain just takes over Portugal in this personal union, so now we have two global powers that are merged under a single monarchy, and together, Spain and Portugal control vast territories across Asia, Africa, and the Americas. So this union instantly gives Spain control over Portugal's overseas empires, and it shifts the balance of power across the seas. Now, the Dutch views this as a huge threat to their survival. They were technically a part of Spain at this time, but they were locked in a battle for their independence, and now the Dutch suddenly find themselves facing a much larger enemy. With Portugal under Spain's crown, they looked unstoppable. The Dutch knew that they couldn't match them with guns alone, so they built a new kind of weapon, and that was private capital. In 1602, 7 private trading companies merged into what would become this company. Look, I'm not going to try and butcher the pronunciation so you can see it on screen, but basically this was the VOC, or as we now call it, the Dutch East India Company. Now it was called the Dutch East India Company because obviously they were Dutch, but also because they did most of their trades with the East Indies, which Europeans use as a term to refer to the region encompassing the islands of present-day Indonesia, Malaysia, and some other surrounding areas. So on the surface, it just looks like some other merchant company, right? But under the decks, it was a machine of economic warfare. It had armed ships, private armies, forts in various parts of the world. But the most radical part of this company were its shares. For the first time, ordinary Dutch citizens could fund imperial expansionism and profit from it. I mean, the VOC could scale like no other kingdom ever had, without a monarch, or without ever raising taxes. This was no longer wealth tied to land or titles. This was wealth manufactured at scale, through markets. Now, the merchants were operating the business. They drew the blueprints, but someone else was keeping the foundation of this company standing. You see, across the Republic, the House of Orange watched all of this unfold. Now, you're probably wondering what the House of Orange is, and, well, no, it's not those guys. I'm talking about this House of Orange, and this house was one of the most prominent dynasties at the time, but they held no kingdoms. By the way, please do support the channel by liking and subscribing. Help us get to 100,000. We're so close. Anyway, as I was saying, the House of Orange simply held a weak title and a fragile peace in the Republic that was run by merchants. Now, their nobility didn't matter much in this new order. They were squeezed from both sides. Amsterdam's elites wanted stronger Republican control. Spain wanted the dynasty extinguished, and they had no land to rule. I mean, no mines to drain. So during the collapse of this old order, the House of Orange faced a choice: fade into irrelevance or adapt. They couldn't rely on feudal land or inherited gold anymore. They used the only thing they had left, and that was capital. You see, the House of Orange didn't run the VOC or the Dutch East India Company, but they sure helped bankroll it. I mean, more importantly, they tied their future to it, and this wasn't just a symbolic gesture. Their involvement gave them strategic leverage in a merchant republic where legacy no longer guaranteed power. Decades later, that connection became official. I want to talk about these two stadholders. Stadholders were basically these high-ranking officials or magistrates, and they were called William IV and V. They were descendants of the House of Orange, and they served as presidents of both the VOC and the West India Company. The West India Company, by the way, essentially traded with the West Indies, which was generally the Americas at the time. As a result, They effectively became amongst the most powerful men in the country and in Europe. As the company expanded east, the family rose upwards from nobility to something far greater. Still without crowns, mind you, but unquestionably, their power was backed by dividends. The VOC carried the Republic's flag, but it also carried the ambitions of a family that was building an empire in silence. The VOC didn't behave like a business. It moved like a sovereign. I mean, that was the whole point. When your market cap dwarfed the GDP of large countries, your private armies defeated military powers. You were not just another company, but you were an imperial state in your right. And at its peak, the Dutch East India Company, or the VOC, was worth more than $7.9 trillion in today's money. As for comparison, the most valuable company in the world today is Nvidia, which is currently half of that valuation. So during the VOC's golden era, from the early 1600s to the mid-1700s, over 1 million people departed the Netherlands bound for Asia. "1 million lives sailing across oceans to serve the world's most powerful trading company. But none of this scale happened in isolation. A powerful state charter, Amsterdam's financial elite, and the strategic backing of the House of Orange. The charter I mentioned carried far more weight than a typical trade license. It felt closer to a royal mandate. It came with full control over Dutch trade in Asia, but its control wasn't limited there. The company could sign international treaties, raise armies, and capture territories, and even govern entire colonies. Every move carried the weight of a sovereign flag, even though the seal came from a company's boardroom. With nearly 150 merchant ships, around 50,000 employees, and its own private force of 10,000 soldiers, the VOC didn't operate from the sidelines. It moved confidently, like a state with sails. And across the map, from the Persian Gulf to Japan, it left its mark, and nowhere was its dominance more profound than in the epicenter of the company's ambitions, the East Indies. In 1610, the VOC gained permission to build a post near the Chilewang River. By 1619, they captured Jayakarta and named it Batavia, the ancient name of the Netherlands. This wasn't just a name change. Batavia became a center of gravity in Asia. It's why you see so much Dutch influence in Indonesia today, whether it comes to food, language, culture, architecture, and so much more. So yeah, the Dutch governors ruled from there. For 300 years, it stood as the company's command hub, and all the surrounding kingdoms and chiefdoms answered to its interests. But this scale of operation needed more than just a bold vision. It needed serious money. Instead of relying on kings or short-term loans, they created something new. And this is where something innovative happens. A system where regular citizens could buy into the company and stay invested. That's what they needed. And that's where the story of VOC's reinvention of power begins. You see, in August 1602, the Dutch East India Company, or VOC, opened its doors to the public, for the first time in human history. A company offers its future to ordinary people through the world's first ever initial public offering. But the whispers began even earlier. You see, the VOCs had made their plans clear in March when it signed a detailed and far-reaching charter. And once the shares hit the market, capital flooded in. Behind the VOC's sails stood the same elites who secretly ruled Dutch cities and who kept money flowing like clockwork back into Amsterdam's markets and banks. But that raised a larger question. What kind of power would help competing powerful families to put aside their differences and work together for a bigger and brighter future? And the answer led back to the House of Orange in Nassau. I mean, sure, they backed this transformation, but they also depended on it heavily. And the House of Orange was still fragile and locked in this strange role. They were stadtholders with royal ambitions, yet no throne to sit on. And abroad, matters were even more volatile. The Catholic superpower of Habsburg Spain was still considering Dutch independence as a crime, one that was punishable by fire. So in this kind of pressure, feudalism offers no solution. The House of Orange had no serfs, no silver mines, no divine right, but they had a winning idea: to rule through the market, and not through the crown. This was revolutionary at that time. They decided to create an entirely new power base beyond land and precious metals, financial institutions that made risk predictable. That was their whole thing. At the core of it were permanent shares. For the first time, ownership in a global enterprise could be transferred freely. They were not just buying shares, but they were betting on what they'd be like tomorrow. They created a market of speculation and arbitrage. In fact, they hedged all the tools Wall Street uses today. But behind the markets and the math, something else was needed. And that was fear of missing out, or good old FOMO. You see, shareholders were not protected by something called limited liability. If a ship sank or a trade route collapsed, investors only lost what they put in. Their personal properties and non-company assets stayed safe, their families stayed secure, and suddenly people were far more confident in investing. It's a concept that we still use today to separate our personal assets from our business liabilities. So the VOC also printed actual share certificates that were stamped, signed, and exchanged freely. I mean, for the first time ever, ownership could be traded. It flowed smoothly from hand to hand, without the need for a royal permission or a family inheritance. This was revolutionary. What's wild is that Dutch financial influence didn't remain confined to the Netherlands for long. It quickly crossed borders, reshaping Britain and later America. This was carried by ideas, institutions, and one man in particular, William of Orange. You see, William was born into the House of Orange-Nassau and held the Prince of Orange title from the start. This title gave him status in the Dutch Republic. His early role brought him into the orbit of Dutch merchants and their financial model. But his true impact came much later, far beyond the Netherlands. In 1688, England was facing a political crisis. King James II had lost the trust of Parliament and much of the population. Tensions were rising fast. And in that moment of instability, the British leaders were looking for anyone who was Protestant with a claim to the throne. Quickly, they turned to James' daughter Mary, who just happened to be married to William of Orange, and they answered at England's time of need. He sailed to England with troops, and with a mindset that was shaped by the Dutch Republic, one that merged capital with governance, and he saw markets not as distractions from power, but as tools to sustain it. But this wasn't just a political reshuffling, it was an actual financial revolution at its core. Decades before William stepped ashore in England, Dutch ships had already crossed the Atlantic. A few years later, in 1624, the Dutch West India Company founded New Amsterdam at the southern tip of modern-day Manhattan. Organized streets, strong trade networks, diverse communities. The Dutch were turning the island into something rare, more precisely, a commercial outpost that was on its way to becoming a financial hub of the New World. But they didn't wipe the city clean. You see, they kept much of the Dutch structure. and London leaned into speculation and fast-moving markets. By the 1700s, the two cities' financial elites began working in sync. Amsterdam's bank-oriented finance cooperated closely with London's market-oriented system. Together, they shaped this new kind of economic dominance. New York inherited legal structures, credit customs, and institutional habits from both Amsterdam and London. That shared DNA quietly laid the groundwork. You see, over time, those foundations helped transform a port town into a financial engine, but not overnight. It formed through decades of shared history. New York absorbed the tools that once made Europe's financial centers thrive, and eventually, it built its own version. This blend fueled both empires and laid the groundwork for international finance as we know it today. I mean, you can see the impact of Dutch financial systems everywhere, from VOC-chartered ports to New York City's early streets, from London's stock exchange to the halls of Parliament. You can see Dutch finance helped write the blueprint for a lot of these things. And long after the VOC's final voyage, its methods continued to echo in boardrooms, banking laws, and stock markets around the world. So it's quite clear that the VOC was revolutionary. It transformed trade, corporate finance, and state power forever. But even a giant has limits. By the late 1700s, cracks had begun to show. The company that once ruled the seas began to sink under the weight of its own ambitions. Power had scaled fast, but oversight failed to keep up, and corruption slowly crept in. Internal divisions deepened, and with rising military costs and competition from Britain and France, the VOC found itself surrounded on all fronts. At first, it managed to survive these internal contradictions, but slowly the grip had loosened. Behind the scenes, the structure grew hollow. Decision-making had turned sluggish, and officials were now focused more on their own pockets than the company's future. Global markets had begun to shift. They became less tolerant of monopolies and opened to faster and more flexible rivals. By 1795, the VOC was no longer all-powerful. The Dutch company had stepped in to take control and nationalize the company. The company managed to stay afloat for nearly 2 centuries. Founded in 1602, with a 21-year trade monopoly in Asia, eventually winding down in 1796 as the Dutch government took over. This once mighty charter had quietly expired, and although the empire collapsed, its architecture of power lived on. Instead of vanishing, the VOC's ideas transformed into modern finance, legal structures, and multinational models that we still rely on today. And nowhere is that legacy more visible in modern-day Netherlands. Today, the Netherlands is no longer a seafaring empire, but it's a financial empire. And the numbers speak for themselves. The Netherlands consistently ranks amongst the most competitive industrial economies on Earth. It's a magnet for global capital, and it's drawing in business from every continent, especially from the United States. Behind this enormous network of capital, one family still continues to cast a very long shadow, and that is the House of Orange-Nassau. They still reign. Their crown may still be ceremonial, but their connections are anything but symbolic. They quietly hold stakes in companies like Shell and maintain discrete wealth through trusts and investment vehicles. In 1907, a new titan emerged. Royal Dutch merged with Shell Transport and Trading Company to form Royal Dutch Shell, which is a pretty common name these days. It's a name that would come to dominate the global energy sector for over a century. And Shell wasn't alone. Today, ING Group stands as one of Europe's most powerful financial institutions. They also trace their roots back to the Netherlands. Built through a series of mergers in the late 20th century, its rise is reflected with long-standing Dutch strength. With operations spanning continents, it still leans on Dutch corporate architecture and legal protections that echo the VOC foundations. Without the VOC and its long influence, both the Netherlands and the world would look very different than it looks today. You see, the merchants and the businessmen who were tied with VOC, they have their descendants now holding stakes in modern corporate giants, and some of them sit quietly on boards and others shape policy through foundations and capital networks. I mean, their surnames rarely make headlines. When we think of capitalism, we often think of names like the Rothschilds, Rockefellers, J.P. Morgan. These names tend to dominate the conversation. But those figures didn't invent the model of capitalism, they just followed it. Long before them, there was the House of Orange, and they are largely responsible for building the capitalist blueprint. They engineered a system where war, trade, and finance moved together. Now look, this video focused a lot on the financial innovations and contributions of the Dutch East India Company, but it's very important that we talk about all the atrocities that they committed, especially during their expansion in Asia. This includes massacres, violence against indigenous populations, and the exploitation of resources and people. Let's just talk about a few examples here. So we have the Banda Islands massacre, where they nearly exterminated the indigenous population. Then you have the Amboina massacre, where the VOC executed a number of English and Japanese traders on the island of Amboina, on accusations of plotting to seize the Dutch fort. Then you have the Batavia massacre, that resulted in the death of thousands of Chinese civilians in what we know today as modern-day Jakarta. These are just a few examples. They were also pretty big fans of forced labor and exploitation. They established a system of forced labor, particularly in spice-producing regions where indigenous populations were compelled to cultivate crops for the company's benefit. This included military actions against indigenous populations, as well as suppression of local political structures and systems. So yeah, they contributed a lot to modern finance. Lots of good stuff. But it's important to keep things in perspective, right? From observing the rise of the VOC to the reign of the Royal Dutch Shell, we can clearly see a pattern emerging, and that is power and capital are always inseparable. And the House of Orange realized this pretty early on, that capital could be more potent than crowns. They transformed trade into a corporate-state hybrid, and they scaled that model across centuries and continents. They left a legacy that defines how the world governs money today. The Netherlands may no longer rule the seas, but Dutch capital now moves across borders with more influence than fleets ever could. So that brings us to a question that still matters very much today, and that is, if markets now hold the power that was once reserved for monarchs, then the question is, who governs the markets? Who holds the crown when the crown is invisible? Here's what I want to know. After learning about the VOC and the House of Orange, do you think today's tech giants like Apple, Amazon, or Nvidia could ever reach that level of power and influence? Comment below, and let's debate this.